Go ahead and do this. Good afternoon, everybody. I'll call this work session to order. It's a work session on AO 2025-56, an ordinance of the Anchorage Municipal Assembly amending Anchorage Municipal Code, Chapter 12.10 to increase the amount of the exemption on taxable business personal property. We'll start with introductions.
Aaron Baldwin Day.
Yarrow Silvers.
Jared Kirker. Keith McCormick.
Daniel Boland.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant on the phone. Mr. Rivera.
Felix Rivera.
Is there anyone else on the phone? Are you there, Mr. Gadamus, on the phone?
Yes, I am here.
All right, thank you. And I think there's one more person on the phone. We don't know who they are. This is a presentation prepared by the sponsor of the ordinance, Mr. Bond.
Sorry, before we start, may I make a quick disclosure?
Sure.
Just because, so I own a small business or I'm a DBA and I am exempt from personal property taxes. So I filled out that form when I started my business. So just to say.
Yeah.
I would also like to make a disclosure, Mr. Chair.
For me to deal with one at a time. First, there is no personal or financial interest that isn't broadly shared by a number of people in the public, and yours is even smaller than that. So it's ruling of the chair, there is no conflict. And Mr. Rowland.
Yeah, I'll just say I'm also a small business owner. I am not exempt. I do pay this tax, and if this AO were to pass, it would impact my tax liability.
And in the same sense, just this benefit, if you will, or liability is shared by a very large number of individuals across the municipality. This isn't something that is personally tailored to your interests and your interests alone, or a very small group of people that you do business with. And so it will also be the ruling of the chair that there isn't a conflict. If anyone wishes to object to that, now would be the time. You have a question, Ms. Silvers? No, okay. I think we're good then. We'll go ahead and proceed. We were joined by Mr. Johnson on the phone just now, which is 104. Oh, okay. Go ahead, Yara. Ms. Silvers.
I also have a small business exempt though.
Okay, and the same ruling will apply. Again, this tax is applied broadly to businesses, and so it isn't something that's narrow. I don't know who is not muted on the phone. Maybe we could have you mute. And if you want to join us up here, we have members of the administration in the audience, or they can lean back and just, in case we need you, we will call on you. I did say that, yeah.
Okay, yeah, we got a lot to cover here in a short amount of time. So thank you all for coming. Cutting our small businesses a break is the name of this presentation. And as you can see from the expert formatting, it was with assistance from Allie Hartman at Legislative Services. Thank you for helping me put this together. Okay, so next slide. So about this ordinance 2025-56, what does it do? It increases the exemption for business personal property taxes. If you don't own a small business, you may be unaware that businesses have to pay taxes on their equipment, furnishings, vehicles. Oh, I think somebody on the phone needs to mute. Okay, thanks. Businesses have to pay taxes on equipment, furnishings, vehicles, and inventory. These are the essential things that they need to operate. Things like desks, computers, retail goods, kitchen appliances. Currently, there is a $20,000 exemption. The AO that has been introduced proposes to increase that to $250,000. Folks may remember that was the amount put forward in one of the substitute versions of the sales tax proposal. So that's where we carried that number over. This was introduced by myself and former member Zolotel. Next slide. So the why. I have both goals and things for us to consider. I also do want to point out that I asked Legislative Services to circulate an article from Forbes that talks about the inventory portion of the of business tax. And so if you have that in your email inbox, highly suggest that you give it a look. It's a pretty easy read. But what do we want to do? What's the reason for this coming forward? Our goals are to support Anchorage as a more competitive business environment relative to our neighboring communities. A little bit later on, we'll talk about what our neighboring communities do with their business tax. We also want to provide relief to small businesses who create local jobs in a competitive market with online retailers and big box stores. Carefully balance the relief for small businesses that we're proposing with impacts of shifting the tax burden. So those are goals. Things to consider. This is the business personal property tax is a difficult tax to enforce. And some small business owners are unaware that they even have to file or pay. In your printed materials here, you'll have two things. Number one, a sample tax bill. So this is what it looks like when you get it in the mail. This is not my tax bill. I want to point that out. This is just a sample that we were sent by the assessor, by Mr. Gadamus. So thank you for providing that. But you can see here kind of what that looks like. And then the other thing I want to point out is you have the instructions for how to file here in a packet. And I think if you give that a look over, you may be able to appreciate just how complex and sort of Byzantine it is to file this tax for businesses. And I think especially for fledgling businesses who are getting started, this can be quite the undertaking. Another consideration is that largely because of the inventory tax component of the business tax, there's disparities between service-based businesses and product-based businesses like retailers or local manufacturers. And we'll discuss this later on in the presentation. Additionally, small businesses right now are facing a lot of uncertainty around cost. That could be tariffs. For instance, my business, we just got our first letter from one of our vendors saying that their prices are going to increase because of tariffs at the federal level. We also had a recent increase in the Alaska minimum wage, so small businesses are having to confront that. I'm personally a fan of that. I supported it, but that's just something that small businesses are having to deal with. And then I just want to talk about taxes as an ecosystem. Who is already getting relief? We do have an existing senior exemption. We also have a residential exemption for homeowners, and that was recently increased. Folks who are on this body, we did that a couple years ago, and I believe we increased it to $75,000. Next slide, please. So the what, as I pointed out, you have your sample tax bill. That's what it looks like, a partial screenshot up on the presentation. You can see in this example that an assessed value of nearly $300,000 results in an annual business property tax bill of almost $5,000. So this is something that does make an impact on businesses. A reminder of what this is a tax on is those things that I described: the furniture, the instruments. If you're a manufacturer and you have a 3D laser printer, you'd be taxed on the value of that. The inventory that you carry. So this is different from real property tax, right? Land, homes, buildings. But I think it's worth noting that small businesses may also pay real property tax if they own their premises. If not, they pay rent to their landlord, who in turn pays that real property tax. So is the business personal property tax the same thing as the inventory tax? No, inventory tax is a subcategory of this tax, but that has big implications on the overall assessed value. So take the example of a high-power law firm versus a small independent clothing brand. What would they be taxed on? Well, the law firm, if they don't lease their furniture and computers, they'll be taxed on that. But the small independent clothing brand, they'd be taxed on the same, as well as all of the retail goods that they carry. And they need to be able to provide those retail goods. That's their business model, right? So they get hit in a way that service-based businesses do not. Taxes on inventory have been criticized for being unfair and inequitable for this reason. They disproportionately impact those retail goods businesses and local manufacturers, industries that rely on inventory to serve customers and maintain their operations. Unlike service-based businesses, which often require fewer physical assets, these businesses must keep stock on hand to meet their customer demand. However, the inventory tax penalizes them for holding that stock, which discourages the very behaviors that they need to thrive. Inventory taxes also disproportionately harm businesses that are already at a disadvantage due to higher cost, limited access to capital, and the potential challenges of a disrupted supply chain or tariffs. They discourage businesses from holding that inventory during periods of uncertainty, which creates a ripple effect that drives up cost, reduces product availability, and ultimately makes it harder for consumers to find the goods that they need. So I think by increasing the overall exemption threshold, we can partially alleviate some of these burdens, allowing businesses to focus on recovery and growth rather than worrying about unnecessary taxes on inventory that they can't replenish as easily. Next slide. So assessed value versus taxes collected. Here you can see how this would change this tax. The assessed value, and when we talk about what's being assessed, it's 3.3 billion. What we collect annually is more in the realm of about 54 million. And so with this exemption increase on the business personal property tax, we would see a projected decrease of about $5 million. Next slide. Okay, so this goes back to the goal of supporting Anchorage as a more competitive environment for businesses relative to our neighboring communities. What do other Alaskan communities do? Well, Fairbanks omits all personal property. The Mat-Su exempts all business personal property and inventory less than $1 million. So that would really be an increase in the exemption. Certainly what we're proposing is far below that. But think about the creating a business environment, and how do we incentivize businesses to start and stay in Anchorage rather than move into the valley, right? Kenai exempts the first 100,000 of business personal property, so they have a larger overall exemption, and they also exempt all inventory held for resale. So that independent clothing brand, that inventory they have, that would be exempt. And then Juneau exempts all business personal property. So quite the difference between these other communities and Anchorage. And in the next two slides, I kind of want to put together, I guess, some options for you to consider. The first, if we go to the next slide, scenarios and effects. Going back to the enforcement capacity, we've had some really great conversations with the property assessor, Mr. Gadamus, on how potentially increasing the exemption would allow them to really focus more on targeted education and enforcement. Under the current $20,000 exemption, there are in Anchorage about 2,800 taxable businesses. If the exemption was increased to $100,000, the amount of businesses taxed would be about 1,700. On the other end, if it were increased to 250,000, that would leave remaining about 1,000 businesses, 1,071 businesses who would be taxed. What that means is it would be less paperwork processing. We know that those filings for the assessor's office. And with that increased capacity, they could really prioritize enforcement, education, and outreach efforts for those more lucrative established businesses and not get bogged down on focusing on the small peanuts, if that, so to speak. Next slide. And here, we talk about the burden shift. Okay, so if we increase the exemption and businesses have to pay less taxes, who picks that up? Well, it's going to be your real property tax. That's going to be your homeowners. It's going to be commercial property owners. And we have laid out here some projections, again, with the help of the administration, about at different amounts, if we were to increase it to 100 or 150,000 or 200 or 250,000, what would be a projected additional cost to property owners? So you can see if we did a $100,000 exemption, that would add about $6 per $100,000 of assessed value. So on a $500,000 home, they'd have an additional impact of $30 annually. Compare that though with the couple thousands of dollars that a small business might pay, right? On the other end, which is currently proposed in the original ordinance, $250,000 would result in about $16. So there you're looking at about $70 to $80 additional on the property tax bill for your average homeowner or a commercial property owner. So I also want to highlight that these projections are based on tax District 3 projections, which includes most of the Anchorage Bowl. So just something to note for that number. If you can look up, if you Google the Muni website, it will show you a map of the different tax districts. I wish I had that for this presentation, but it's pretty easy to find if you want to look that up. So what's next? As I said, the original ordinance, which has been introduced, was introduced by myself and member Zolotel. And then in yesterday's rules committee, I let you guys know that I'm teaming up with member McCormick and member Silvers to research this project. And we will very likely be bringing forward an S version that will contemplate a more right-sized exemption and incorporate a suggested amendment from the administration on how we might help reduce the bureaucratic processing demands of filings for exempt businesses. Ideally, we would have a streamlined way for businesses that are completely exempt to just declare so, and then they would not have to perform the full complex filing. That would save time for both those businesses and for municipal staff. And that will conclude our presentation. Thank you. Happy to take questions, or maybe we would want to hear from the administration, sort of their thoughts on this.
Mr. Falsey.
Thank you to Member Boland. Thank you to the Assembly members. I think what the administration's point of view would say first, thanks to Member Boland and to former Vice Chair Zaltel for surfacing this issue and bringing it to our attention. I think we agree in theory that there is something that could be productively done here. The current exemption level of $20,000 was set in 2005. Even if you just unthinkingly said, let's adjust that for inflation, that would be $33,000 or $35,000 now. So it's probably something that's worthy of attention just to keep up with the times. But to the major motivating factors that were surfaced in the presentation, fairness and efficiency, I think those are both correct, that if we have a tax which is very imperfectly complied with at the low level, it probably behooves us for fairness reasons just to adjust the tax so that we have more uniform compliance. And for efficiency's sake, there probably is an efficiency gain to be had by cutting off some of the low-level returns so that we can focus on the higher dollar returns that really matter. I think as the administration, we did surface two issues. One is currently there is a requirement for all businesses to file a tax return. If you are under $20,000 for several years, you can file a shorter form. If there is a big adjustment to the exemption, it may well make sense to say there is no return required at all until you reach some level. And then there is probably a window where you file a $0 return for a bit so that people are on notice that they're on the cusp of cresting over into the taxable era. But that should be something that I think we're going to continue to work with the involved members as we work towards an S version. And then the bigger one, which is to say, as part of the tax ecosystem, it certainly is true that if we exempt taxes here and we have the same level of need overall, we're going to have to find those dollars somewhere else. As an initial take, it feels like the $250,000 limit is probably a bit more than we'd want to bite off in one go round. So the 100,000 feels a little bit potentially more comfortable, but that's part of the ongoing conversation and all things that we are excited to collaborate with the Assembly members on.
So I have Ms. Brawley and myself, and thank you, Ms. Brawley.
Yeah, thanks. I'm excited to see this go forward. And I remember the conversation during Project Anchorage. So I'm glad that this was originally brought up in that context and then has now moved forward separately. I do agree that I think the 100,000, or I should say, I think starting lower seems more palatable to me, partly because, and I really appreciate the outline of the tax or the cost shift, which, you know, is not a lot in itself, but obviously we've had a lot of these cost shifts and same with increasing the residential exemption, right? That it pushed more taxes on other folks in a nominal way. But along those lines too, I'm thinking, you know, we've seen the impact of inflation. What if we built in somehow, and I don't know legally if this is possible, but built in an escalator. So, you know, every 3 years it increases by some predictable amount so that it can roughly keep up with inflation. And I don't know what that would look like. I don't want to make it overly complicated, but that's just something to think about. You know, not coming up with dollars and cents specific, but maybe by 10,000 every 5 years or something like that. And then the other question to raise is, I saw the effective date would be January 1st, 2026. That is when all these valuations take place. is there some kind of nuance there where it needs to be in effect sooner so that the department can ramp up and kind of make these changes? I don't know the answer to that. Or is it just the January 1st, that the scope of this ordinance already covers that? And that would be more if you add other pieces around required filing. So those are my thoughts.
That's just from the real estate perspective, the taxation is levied on the first, period, full stop. And so anything that we have in place by the first will be what is the standard for those properties. And so ultimately, that is the right time.
Yeah, well, and maybe if I could just clarify, I understand that point. What I'm saying is if there is a ramp up where the code change needs to be in place before that date.
Again, if it passes on the 20th of May or whenever the first meeting in June, then they will have 9 months to have it prepared.
Well, why don't we ask, we do have Mr. Gadamus on the phone, in terms of the timeline and particularly, I think for the administration's suggestion to have either a shorter form or just a way to say, I'm exempt, I don't have to file. Do you feel like, Jack, that would give your team time to kind of effectuate those changes?
Yeah, can you hear me all right now?
Sorry, say that again, Jack?
So I think the answer is for this question. I'd like to have 2020
Jack, you're breaking up a
gear
little
up a
bit.
little bit more, take the time. I'm sorry.
That's
Can
okay.
you hear
Maybe
me
we'll come
better now?
back to you in a few. I don't know how you want to do it, Chair.
I'll go ahead and put Jared in the queue. Go ahead, Jared.
Thanks. Yeah, look, I like this. I like the idea, I like the concept that we're cutting a break for small businesses. And you've got me right up to the very end when we start talking about shifting the cost, though. Rather than shift the cost, I'd like to see us have a conversation about cutting our costs instead. And maybe if we can get small business a break without having to put more taxes on homeowners who are already feeling the pain, right? I mean, it's already pretty expensive out there. And that's one of the things I know that I heard then that I hear a lot from people in Chugiak Eagle River. So rather than just shifting the cost, I would say, let's see if we can't cut the cost somewhere. And I don't know if that's something you've looked at, if there's, any priorities we'd want to, look at where we can cut, but that would sure make me feel a lot more comfortable about this going forward rather than putting the burden already on an overburdened tax base.
So I think that's probably a broad conversation for the budget cycle and not for this ordinance. But it's certainly something folks can put on the table. And I have myself in the queue, and I'll just say, for my part, the level that was listed, even at the 100,000, is higher probably than I'm comfortable with. We allow residential properties up to $75,000 of exemption. And so I am not sure why we would, and the last time we increased that, we doubled it. This is a multiplication of 10 times, 11 times the current exemption. And so I would look to be parable to the residential property tax exemption is probably where my comfort level is at in the conversation about the levels and how much of a shift we would put onto other properties. So that's just my 2 cents in the conversation, and I may be prepared with an amendment to that effect. And are you ready to try again, Jack?
Mr. Chair, I can say that I've found Jack on Teams, and he had said that what he would like to add was that he would like to keep the short form.
Can you hear me better now?
On the pulse of businesses, but that, as I mentioned earlier, that the
Hold on,
requirement to file the short form could begin at a much higher level. So that right now, the regime is short form if you have 20,000 or less, and then long form. In the future, there may be no form, short form, long form.
So that wasn't the question though. The question was, is the effective date needing to be earlier for them to be prepared on the first of the year to enter the new tax regime?
And I think, without stepping on Jack's toes, I think the answer is the effective date should still be January 1st, but then the sooner you pass it, the longer of a heads up we have to get ready for that effective date.
Right. So thank you. Others on this? So I think the answer to Jared, your question would be, when we settle on a number, whatever that number is, there could be a reduction, but probably the reduction would be general, not just to the business property tax owner or the residential, because that's how the appropriations work. So, go ahead.
Okay, and I just don't know. Would there be any interest in like an amendment saying, hey, when this is how much money we're going to raise from this, we're going to mandate that we cut this much when we get to the budget process at the end of the year?
I think you could try that.
I could try it. All right, we'll see.
I run that by the attorneys and see what they say, but that's part of the, go ahead.
So I think one thing I didn't speak to in the well, I guess I have a reiteration and then one thing I didn't mention. The reiteration is many of these businesses do pay both property tax and their business tax. And so again, the business tax ends up being, it can be pretty substantial, in thousands of dollars. So we're talking about $30 to an average homeowner versus thousands of dollars to a business. So I just hope that we can hold those things in balance. The thing that, oh gosh, it just left my brain. Maybe go to Aaron, then come back to me.
Ms. Baldwin.
So really, though, with respect to the scenarios and the effects, we're not mandating in this AO how a $5 million, well, at a $250,000 exemption, where that $5 million shortfall will be covered. We're just saying that that's what we think will happen at $250,000 of exemption, right? And so there's nothing that I read anyway in this AO that says, and we will then shift that burden to real personal property. So that's an open question, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is there's no way to mandate
So I
where.
think the assessor would tell you, and Anna may have a different answer to this. She asked me in the queue that it's one pool of ultimately levied taxes. And under the cap and the calculations, if it's not going here, it's going to the other taxpayers. And so the shift ultimately moves to both the commercial and residential property taxpayer. And so that would be how it happens. And so it would be directed.
And then,
So it is
sorry.
pie. It is pie. Okay.
Under the tax cap.
But to Member Gerker's point, via the budget process, if there's a will to provide relief, then we keep that top of mind in the budget. You did remind me of my other point. Going back to the staff capacity and the enforcement, education and enforcement, I think what has not been projected, but I could see would be beneficial is that if they have the capacity to really go after those bigger fish and make sure that people are paying accurately, or those filings, or even paying at all, that might actually offset some of that loss. Does that make sense? I think part of the problem right now is we're probably not collecting everything that we could. I think I can't state that as a fact, but I am fairly confident that that's the case because I know business owners who have no idea that this exists. I also know a couple of business owners who they keep their equipment in the valley, even though because they have a job that they can do remotely. And so there's loopholes and ways to get around that. In one of the, and I don't really want to go like too into detail about what those loopholes are because I don't want people who are listening to utilize them. But in one of the informational things, we have some information that was provided from Mr. Gadamus on compliance and what their efforts. They do have a canvassing program where staff visit commercial areas to verify business activity, update their records, educate the owners on filing requirements. But it's just interesting to think about if we were able to really do that effectively, we could capture some additional business property tax, and maybe that the impact to the real property tax owners wouldn't be as great.
Aaron.
Do we have similar projections for what the lost revenue would look like at a $100,000 exemption, 150 and 200?
So you mean on like the slide where it shows it going down, those revenues?
Right, yeah, so based on this AO, it's a $5.3 million decrease.
But that's
Do
at
we have those
250.
numbers for 100,000, 150,000, and 200K?
Not here today, I don't think, but we could probably get those numbers.
I'd
Yeah.
love to see that.
And I think I'll just, if it's okay with members McCormick and Silvers, I think where we're headed on the S version, just so folks know, is that 100,000 level. To us, that seems pretty right sized. And, would still provide minimal relief, but again, a more mild impact to other taxpayers.
Mr. Gates.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to make 2 comments. One, you mentioned possibly an amendment, I think, to track the residential real property tax exemption amount. Both of those, this exemption for business personal property and the residential real property exemptions were implemented the same year, 2005. Both were 20,000 at the time. So I guess if we're going to track that, we would be looking at a 75,000 exemption, same as real property. And so I just wanted to give that history. And then second, I thought maybe to understand the tax burden shifting, that I might give a quick example, but it's hard to estimate. So I guess last year's budget, we had about 265 million collected from our property taxes, real and personal, all taxable, real and personal property in the way. For an example, let me use 400,000 because our budget fluctuates each year, right? So suppose we need 400 million for next year's budget, and decrease of 5.3 million, then I guess that we were looking at, we were using that based on 2024 values and amounts. But if we needed 400 million and now we're expecting 5.3 million, yes, then we're looking at 394.3 million, right, 0.7 million that we need to collect if we didn't want to affect the other, I guess, if we didn't want to fill the gap and just not increase other taxes. That would be the amount we would apply to all taxable real and personal property, which can be minus the tax base of 273 million valued business personal property tax inventory. They no longer applies to that amount of the tax base. So if you see what I mean, except as we know, every year our budget goes up with inflation and costs and things like that. So going from 400 million to 394.7, I don't know if that's realistic, but that'd be what it takes to not affect, I guess, spreading the burden to other taxpayers. And I guess I would invite the administration to correct me in my example.
That would be not an insignificant cut. And so, yeah, and definitely not something wise to do in the abstract. We need to do it specifically. I have a question for the administration. It's not one to be answered today, I don't think, but maybe. There's an interesting and intriguing set of circumstances Mr. Vollen just described, which is there is a level of compliance that at the lower end is very hard to ensure and probably is pretty Swiss cheese. And at the top, we have our largest collections, the larger kind of commercial property owners, big grocery stores and those kind of things, the big properties, the big Conoco and all of those folks. And so there's probably some analysis due on where the sweet spot might be, rather than just an off the cuff. We're more comfortable with the 100,000 of where the kind of your analysis or your kind of perception of compliance would hit the higher level versus the lost or shifted income. So I don't know kind of how you might do that, but present to us, maybe that's Jack, maybe that's Glenn, and maybe it's Bill, together some analysis on the sweet spot so that we have some thinking applied to that question that's not just from the hip. Because I think that's the most intriguing value set there from a broader perspective. I recognize there are property taxpayers in the personal property tax universe who think this is a great idea, and others who think, well, I don't want to pay that. But if there is a sweet spot of efficiency and we can zoom in on that, it would be very helpful.
And I'll say, I'm happy to take that away and chat about that with the assessor's office. My suspicion, though, is that it's going to be a little bit of a finger in the wind and a gut check regardless, because if we knew we had imperfect compliance, we would insist on perfect compliance. So it's going to be, It's gonna be a little bit of a guess that.
Right. I don't know that that's actually true. I think we've become very comfortable accepting what we call Wagners on the industry, a wild ass guess that's not easily refuted from Airbnb or other payers who we accept it. We trust them. And so I think it is a level of comfort in the uncertain, but I think it's a little bit more than just a thumb in the wind. It's what can we get from the numbers that we have? And we don't have the resources to go chasing after the small folks anyway. So it's also a resource application question. Like, where's that spot at where it's worth it to go and do this? So we might actually reduce absurd collections on people who are just, imminent rule followers and the avoidance of those who are not. But that sweet spot, I think you can give us a good way to look at it. I have Anna in the queue then, Daniel.
Yeah, I think this is kind of going back a little bit, but just some general points about the tax cap and kind of how, and this is a topic we're going to come back to in a lot more detail. So I think the first thing is, it is definitely pie. I wanted to also offer, and I'll send around, I sent comments in on a legislative bill, but it was really background on kind of how our system works. So it just for scale, we're talking about a $5.3 million reduction in taxes and however much it was in exempt value. Let's see, is it this? Okay, so it'd be about 400.
That's the assess. This is the.
Okay. Okay. Anyway, it's some part or some chunk of exempt assessed value. For comparison, right now the state requires us to exempt up, at least 150,000 for seniors and disabled veterans on their real property taxes. The total impact of that is almost $3.3 billion of our assessed value. So for scale, and I'll send this around. There's a whole chart. This is something the assessor does versus the total exempt value of personal property. So not just this business, but I also believe it's mobile homes are in there as well. That's 59 million. So we're talking 3.3 billion versus 59 million. So in terms of, and we can't touch that mandatory tax exemption, but it's just important to understand the scale of what we're talking about and the impact of the state telling us what we have to exempt. For the residential property tax exemption, that is optional. That is 3.7 billion. So all of us who own homes get a total of 3.7 billion exempt value. So in terms of scale, and then I think it is also important to understand that there have been instances where we've reduced the cap intentionally. So the marijuana tax, Proposition 14, did a one-time $1 million reduction of the cap. So that is something that has been done. That was in the charter. I don't know if it's something we can do or if it's something voters have to do. But it was tied to this other piece. But we never get that million back. So basically, every time we reduce the budget, it's a forever reduction. It's not like the state budget where they can increase or decrease the budget. So that's also the implication is you're cutting not just at that one point, but you're never going to get it back. That's the way the tax cap works. So that's just things to be aware of. And really what we're talking about is who pays, and then the decisions about what we're paying for are really two separate things. They're related, but they're two decision points. So as Chris said, that would be discussed during the budget process. So they could be tied together. And then the last thing I'll say is if we're talking about a $5.3 million reduction, that is the size of multiple municipal departments. Or it's a chunk out of police or fire, the two biggest departments. So that's kind of something, and I'm not advocating for any of this. I'm saying that's just something to think about is, would it be a marginal cut to a whole bunch of departments? Would it be cutting departments in half? So it's helpful to start thinking about scale, and then we'll come back to this bigger picture of the budget. But that's kind of, we're really fiddling around the edges with this, I guess is what I would say, regardless of what decision is made. But it is, all of these things are cost shifts, but there's already some massive cost shifts that we have accepted or are required to do. So that's important to understand. Thanks.
Daniel?
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate Anna bringing that up. I certainly don't want to downplay the fact that our property taxes here in Anchorage are high, and I think some people certainly struggle with that. On the flip side, I will say with those exemptions that we have, both the senior and residential exemptions, recently we, the assessor's office changed the way they assess condos. That went up some people saw some increases on their tax bill, condo owners. However, prior to that, I know I have at least one very civically minded constituent who, but with those two exemptions, they were paying zero in property taxes. And so they would make a voluntary contribution just because they felt like it was immoral to not pay any property taxes. And so again, when we consider that ecosystem of taxes and who's already getting relief, I think that we have some great exemptions already built into our code for property tax. And then I wanted to go back to Chris's point on the sweet spot. Jasmine, can we go back to slide number 8 where it says scenarios and effects on the top? The one right before that. Perfect. Well, I guess, yeah, I have an extra slide in here that you don't have. So yes, but so at the $100,000 amount, the 40% of what are now taxable businesses would be completely exempt. So we're not quite having essentially the workload of the assessor's office, but we're close. And so that's, again, where I think there's a lot of opportunity for them to do the education and the enforcement in a more productive way if we could make a significant reduction in the amount of businesses that even have to be subject to this. I think if we go, I guess I worry if we go much lower, then at a certain point, it's not meaningful relief for small businesses who, again, are competing with the Amazons of the world. And that is, by the way, addressed in whether or not Amazon pays this is addressed in one of the packets that you have. But also, if we go much lower, not really substantially reducing the bureaucracy that the assessor's office has to do to process all these filings. So that's just my take on that.
Thank you. Others? Okay, so I think this item would be back before us at our next meeting. Obviously, there's interest in the conversation and we'll see where it lands. With that, we will be adjourned until
Awesome.
10 a.m.
Thank you all.